You know, I always thought my solar setup was one of those things that just quietly worked in the background. Panels soaking up sunlight, batteries storing energy, the whole system humming along like a well-oiled machine. And for the most part, it did. Until HOA, Karen decided it was her personal charging station. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe she didn't realize it was my grid. Maybe she thought it was shared somehow. But no, it happened again. And then again. Every day, there she was, plugging her Tesla into my system, completely oblivious, or maybe perfectly aware, that she was intruding on my property, my electricity, my peace of mind. The first time I noticed, I was standing outside, checking the inverter readings when I saw the cable dangling from the Tesla, plugging right into my grid. I froze. Part of me wanted to storm over, rip the cord out, and shout until my lungs hurt. But another, calmer part of me, the part that's learned a few things about patience, strategy, and subtle revenge over the years, kicked in. This wasn't just about anger. It was about teaching a lesson, a memorable one, without crossing into outright destruction. I spent that evening pacing, thinking about what to do. I could have called the HOA board and complained formally, filed a report, maybe even started a legal dispute. But that felt reactive. I wanted proactive. I wanted creative. And most of all, I wanted a lesson that Karen couldn't ignore. So I started researching. I read manuals, studied the inverter system, checked voltage limits, safety parameters. Everything. I didn't want to harm her car, and I didn't want to blow my own system. But I wanted her to realize that plugging in without permission wasn't acceptable. The next day, I started small, just observing. Every time she drove up, Tesla humming, ready to draw power, I would watch quietly from the porch. She had this smug little grin, like she'd discovered some loophole in the universe. And each time, I took note. The time of day, the duration she left it plugged in, how the system responded. It felt almost cinematic, like I was directing a tiny drama where I was both the protagonist and the playwright. My kids noticed, too. "Dad, why are you staring at her car again?" one asked. I just smiled. We're observing, learning, and preparing. Which was partially true. By midweek, I had a plan forming in my head. I wouldn't touch the car physically. I wouldn't disconnect it or call the cops. Instead, I'd adjust the system within safe limits to make a point. I'd increase the voltage slightly, not enough to damage anything, but enough that the Tesla would display warnings, maybe give her that moment of confusion where she realized, wait, something's off. The anticipation alone was thrilling. I imagined her reaction, the subtle panic, the awareness finally dawning that she wasn't entitled to just plug in whenever she wanted. I prepared carefully. I double-checked all safety limits. I recalibrated the inverter, set parameters, and ran simulations. I didn't want to harm the battery, the car, or the wiring. This wasn't about destruction. It was about psychological impact, a lesson delivered with precision. And then came the moment of truth. Karen pulled into the driveway again, Tesla ready, confident, unaware that her little adventure was about to be interrupted by a harmless but unmistakable consequence. I stood by the control panel, heart racing, sipping my coffee like a director about to cue a scene. She plugged in. Immediately, the dashboard lit up with warnings, notifications flashing, something that made her pause mid-step. She looked at the display, frowned, tapped the touchscreen, and muttered under her breath. And I just leaned back, watching, trying not to laugh too loudly, because this was the moment where patience, preparation, and creativity converged perfectly. Over the next hour, Karen fiddled with the settings, unplugged, replugged, and even looked at me through the window, clearly confused. I waved, innocently, pretending to check the inverter readout. All while inside, I felt that subtle, quiet satisfaction that comes from executing a plan that's clever, harmless, and undeniable. My system was safe. Her Tesla was safe. And yet, the lesson was delivered. Later that evening, I documented everything, screenshots, logs, timestamps. I wanted a record, both for my own amusement and in case any questions arose. This was my strategy: patience, observation, preparation, and execution, all layered together to deliver a consequence without ever crossing the line into actual damage or conflict. And it worked beautifully. By the end of the week, Karen stopped plugging in so casually. She might still eye the system occasionally, but she no longer assumed she had a right to it. And that, I realized, was the point. This story wasn't about power or vengeance. It was about boundaries, respect, and showing, subtly but effectively, that actions have consequences. Even small, seemingly inconsequential ones like plugging into someone else's solar grid. The next few days were a delicate dance. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing, but I also had to make sure nothing dangerous happened. Safety first. Tesla is sensitive technology, and my solar inverter system was designed to operate within certain voltage limits. I wasn't trying to fry her car. I was trying to deliver a subtle, unforgettable lesson. Every time Karen approached the charging station, I would glance at the display, double-check the parameters, and prepare for the tiny fireworks of confusion that I knew were coming. She had no idea, of course. From the street, she looked calm, confident, the kind of person who believes the rules bend in her favor. She'd plug in, scroll through the Tesla dashboard, humming a little tune, completely oblivious that her behavior had finally triggered a reaction she wasn't expecting. And each time she did, I felt that mix of anticipation and quiet satisfaction. It was almost cinematic, the Tesla's dashboard lighting up, little alerts blinking, and Karen stepping back with a confused frown, glancing around like the universe itself had betrayed her. I documented everything meticulously. Logs, screenshots, timestamps, the pattern of her plugging in, even small notes about her reactions. This wasn't paranoia, it was strategy. Strategy that ensured if anyone asked, I could explain exactly what happened and why, all while staying completely within legal and ethical limits. And Karen, unaware of how carefully I had prepared, kept returning to the charger. It was like she was daring the system to respond, and the system, my system, was ready. One afternoon, she came out wearing sunglasses, the sun reflecting off the roof panels, holding her phone, ready to monitor her battery charge. She plugged in, smiled, and then froze. Notifications started flashing, warnings popped up, and her confident grin slowly melted into confusion. She tapped the screen, blinked a few times, and muttered, What is going on?" I stood a few feet away, pretending to adjust the inverter, taking a sip of coffee, acting casual. And inside, I was quietly thrilled. The moment I had envisioned had arrived. Over the next several hours, she tried everything. Rebooting the car, disconnecting and reconnecting, even checking her own home systems to see if the problem was there. And each attempt was subtly foiled by the settings I had adjusted. Nothing harmful, nothing permanent, just enough disruption to get her attention and make her realize, you don't just use someone else's electricity without permission. The look on her face when the warnings popped up, her frown, the way she tapped the dashboard repeatedly, it was priceless, almost theatrical. I even started timing her visits, observing the exact intervals she would plug in and unplug. This was no longer about frustration. It had become a game of strategy. Every time she approached, I was ready. Every time, the same sequence played out. Plug in, warnings, confusion, muttering, glance around. I could almost hear her thinking, is this some kind of malfunction? Meanwhile, my kids would watch from the porch, whispering excitedly, Dad, she looks so confused. I laughed quietly, trying to maintain my composure. By midweek, the pattern had established itself. Karen began arriving with slightly more caution, hesitating before plugging in, glancing at the inverter display. And that was exactly the subtle psychological shift I wanted to see. She wasn't angry, at least not openly, but she was thinking, hesitating, recognizing boundaries she had previously ignored. The lesson was sinking in, quietly, cleverly, without a single confrontation. At this point, I started documenting the reactions more creatively. Videos of her attempts, annotated screenshots, even diagrams showing how the solar output interacted with her Tesla's charging system. It wasn't for public shaming. It was just for proof and, honestly, for my own amusement. I could already imagine explaining it to a friend. She thought she could use my solar grid? Watch what happens when you play by the rules, and I adjust the game. Then came the moment of true drama. Karen plugged in one afternoon during peak sun hours, fully expecting a perfect charge. Instead, her dashboard lit up with multiple warnings, notifications, and a subtle glitch in the charging sequence. She stared at the screen, tapped, unplugged, replugged, and muttered under her breath. Finally, she looked around, directly at me, and said, Is something wrong with the system? I smiled innocently and replied, Everything seems fine on my end. The confusion, the pause, the slight panic, It was perfect. Over the next day, Karen tried more deliberate actions. She checked cables, asked a neighbor if they knew anything, even consulted Tesla forums. And yet, the pattern persisted. Every time she plugged in, subtle warnings, slight changes in voltage within safe limits, minor disruptions that made her realize she couldn't just take power freely. I observed all of it from the porch, quietly, satisfied. This was not revenge in a harmful sense. It was education, delivered creatively and ethically. I also reached out quietly to a local technician, hypothetically, to ensure that everything I was doing was safe for the Tesla and my system. Safety was paramount. I wasn't trying to fry the car. I wasn't trying to damage anything. The goal was clear: teach a lesson, enforce boundaries, and do it with cleverness, patience, and strategy. And in every subtle warning Karen experienced, that lesson was reinforced. By the end of the week, Karen's behavior had shifted dramatically. She stopped plugging in so freely, she checked for permission more often, and she hesitated whenever she approached the charging station. And that, I realized, was the true measure of success. Not anger, not escalation, not confrontation. It was compliance achieved through clever planning, subtle action, and respect for boundaries. I had learned a few important lessons too. Patience is more powerful than immediate reaction. Evidence, preparation, and understanding of the system are far more effective than yelling or threats. And sometimes, subtle creativity can teach lessons that confrontation never could. The Tesla remained unharmed, my system remained intact, and Karen had finally learned to respect the rules. Finally, I took a step back, observing my solar grid, the Tesla now cautiously unplugged, and the quiet victory that had unfolded. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, but it worked. And the satisfaction? That quiet, cunning, clever satisfaction that comes from doing the right thing strategically, it's hard to beat. By the weekend, the situation had finally reached its peak. Karen had plugged in her Tesla one last time, confident as ever, humming along, expecting nothing to go wrong. And then the dashboard lit up with the subtle, harmless warnings I had calibrated. She paused, stared at the screen, tapped a few buttons, and muttered, "What the?" Her confidence was gone. She unplugged, looked around, and there it was. The realization that she couldn't just use my solar grid whenever she felt like it. That moment, the pause, the sudden awareness, was the culmination of days of planning, patience, and careful execution. I watched from the porch, pretending to adjust the inverter casually, sipping my coffee, while inside I felt a quiet thrill. It wasn't about anger anymore. It wasn't about revenge in a harmful sense. It was about enforcing boundaries in a way that was clever, safe, and undeniable. Karen finally got the point, and the Tesla, the solar system, and my sanity remained intact. The lesson had been delivered without confrontation, shouting, or escalation. And in that quiet victory, I found a profound satisfaction that I hadn't experienced with any shouting match or legal fight. Over the next few days, Karen's behavior shifted completely. She stopped plugging in indiscriminately, began checking with me before using the system, and even started joking about it awkwardly when she saw me outside. It was subtle, but the lesson had sunk in. Boundaries were respected, authority acknowledged, and I could finally relax without watching the driveway every 5 minutes. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, but it was perfect. My kids noticed the change too. They giggled every time she approached, whispering to each other, "Dad got her." And I explained, quietly, that this wasn't about being mean or retaliating. It was about patience, observation, and clever problem solving. It was about respecting property, asserting boundaries, and doing it smartly. They nodded, eyes wide, understanding the lesson without me having to lecture them. Sometimes actions teach lessons better than words. Neighbors started noticing subtle changes as well. Mrs. Patel waved from across the street with a knowing smile. "Looks like someone learned the rules," she whispered as she passed by. I nodded, enjoying the small acknowledgement. It was one of those rare situations where the lesson was absorbed quietly, effectively, and without anyone getting hurt. And that, to me, was the true victory. Reflecting on it, I realized there were a few key takeaways from the whole ordeal. First, patience and preparation are more effective than immediate reactions. Yelling or rushing would never have achieved the same result. Second, knowledge, knowing your system, understanding safety limits, and staying within legal boundaries. amplifies the impact of any action. Third, subtlety can be incredibly powerful. By delivering a lesson through experience rather than confrontation, you ensure it sticks, and it sticks without creating unnecessary enemies or chaos. Karen, of course, wasn't thrilled. I could still see her glancing nervously at the inverter on occasion, checking readings, wondering if another surprise might be waiting. And I allowed myself a small chuckle every time I noticed. That quiet tension, that subtle awareness, was exactly what I had hoped for. It wasn't about making her miserable. It was about showing, gently but unmistakably, that boundaries matter and entitlement has limits. The Tesla remained unharmed. My solar system continued to function perfectly, and my family could finally enjoy our energy in peace. And as I watched sunlight spill across the yard, I understood something important. Cleverness, patience, and strategy often deliver satisfaction far beyond confrontation or anger. You don't need to escalate. Sometimes the quiet, calculated move teaches the lesson far more effectively. Now, here's the part one really want viewers to think about. What would you do if someone kept using your property, your resources, your electricity, your space, without permission? Would you confront them immediately, argue, or take legal action? Or would you find a creative, safe, and clever way to assert your rights and make the point unforgettable? Comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. Was my reaction fair, clever, or over the line? Have you ever had to deal with a neighbor who ignored boundaries, and how did you respond? Sometimes, the best victories aren't dramatic. They aren't loud. They aren't fueled by anger. They come from preparation, intelligence, and subtle execution. They are the kind of victories that teach lessons without harming anyone, that shift behavior without confrontation, and that leave everyone involved understanding the consequences of their actions. And sitting here on the porch, sipping coffee, watching Karen's Tesla untouched but no longer misused, I felt that quiet, satisfying, intelligent victory. In the end, this story isn't just about a solar system, a Tesla, or HOA entitlement. It's about boundaries, fairness, strategy, and patience. It's about knowing that the way you handle a situation can define not just the outcome, but your own sense of satisfaction and moral clarity. And it's about teaching lessons in a way that sticks, sometimes more effectively than shouting ever could. So, what would you do if it happened to you? Could you stay calm, think creatively, and enforce boundaries without escalating? Or would you lose your cool? Drop your stories in the comments, share your experiences, and let's talk about clever, ethical problem solving, neighborly boundaries, and what fair retaliation really looks like. I want to see what you think. Because at the end of the day, cleverness beats confrontation, patience beats anger, and a lesson delivered thoughtfully is far more powerful than any shouted warning. And that, my friends, is the real victory, the quiet, intelligent, satisfying victory that leaves everyone wiser and boundaries respected.